All right, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Joe Levy, and I serve as the Executive Director of Assessment and Accreditation at National Louis University, which is a private nonprofit, medium-sized doctoral granting urban institution in Chicago, Illinois. We're also a Hispanic serving institution. And in my position, I oversee institutional and programmatic accreditation efforts. I also oversee institutional assessment efforts, both on the academic side as well as with student affairs, and prior learning assessment, or credit for prior learning, which is also in my camp. Just a little bit about me. I came up on the student affairs side of the house. Got my master's in student affairs and higher education, but then fell into assessment work, which backdoored my way into academics and academic affairs, as well as accreditation work. And yeah, that's where I've spent my careers, doing that work at a number of different institutions, especially institutions that are adult serving, which is why I've been a little shocked at then the number of institutions that do not have robust credit for prior learning opportunities for their students. And so I'm here today to talk about how to leverage prior learning assessment or credit for prior learning efforts to advance equity at your institution. So I shared a little bit about myself and wanted to hear a little bit about who you all are. And so we weren't able to, given the structure of the setup, I wasn't able to insert polls, but it looks like we have a fairly small, intimate group here. So you can just write in the chat which best describes your role. It would be helpful to know who's here and who I'm talking to so that I can best try and cater examples for the session, as well as know who who's asking questions and what perspective you're asking that from. So feel free to use the chat feature there to say which best describes your role. If you're an administrator, an assessment person, faculty member, a graduate student, staff member, wear multiple hats, other. And yeah, thanks, Delma. Feel free to share where you're from as well, if you like. Really cool. So we're getting a good mix here. Assessment professionals, faculty members, administrators. Awesome. Well, feel free to keep introducing yourself, as well as feel free to use the chat to offer commentary as well as questions. I'll be doing my best to check it and make sure I'm elaborating on anything. I have some natural kind of stopping points where I'll quick check in and see if anybody has questions, as well as some time at the end built in for reflection. But otherwise, I will carry on here. So the outcomes and the structure of the session will largely, you'll be able to explain the equity and PLA relationship, identify considerations for learning outcomes, equity considerations for learning outcomes, equity's impact in method selection, and ways to infuse equity in reporting. And that we'll have some time at the end for reflecting on how to apply this. And so I may have tipped it a little bit with my role being that I oversee assessment and PLA, but I will say that the content I'm sharing today, while there's some specific literature and research about PLA in particular that I'll share, this also, all this information also applies to just general assessment practices. So that's a nice dual purpose if you're an assessment professional or involved with that work and here for this content. This information is applicable both for PLA or credit for prior learning, as well as just general assessment practices. Okay, so equity in PLA context. we know that the racial and socioeconomic profile of students advancing from K-12 education to higher education has changed substantially over time, and that higher education has become more accessible to students that have historically been underrepresented. However, disparities in educational outcomes suggest that the ways in which underrepresented or minoritized students experience higher education is different than minoritized peers. And outcomes measurement or outcomes assessment has become a critical way to provide evidence of educational impact and calls for accountability. Now, Kale did a report with Witchy exploring possible factors around PLA, CPL credits, and they did this study, which is what they did in and of itself, the PLA boost. But then they found some equity paradoxes, and so they've done some follow-up, and actually they've been on a bit of a presentation circuit to share this information and share what they were finding. And I'm going to get into a little bit that here. So the study that they had, the original one, was 72 institutions, and they found that people who engage in prior learning assessment or credit for prior learning adult students, they save time and money in earning their credentials. So not only did they get the PLA or the CPL credit, but in the long run, it saved them money and saved them time as they were heading towards their ultimate credentials. And this effect was strong and positive for all races, ethnicities, income levels, gender, just about every demographic they were looking for. However, PLA was only used in about 1 in 10 adult students. And so this goes back to my introductory comment of how I've been surprised at how a number of institutions aren't offering PLA or CPL, or even if they are, that they might not be doing the best job engaging their adult learners to know about those opportunities. But on top of that, PLA usage was lowest for adult students who are Black, lower income, or enrolled at community colleges. So the promise of CPL or PLA is that it's to be this tool for equity, right? To help students who have this prior learning, help them advance through their career and through their academic journey. But that's not realized if those students are not taking advantage and receiving credit. So how do we explain that Black and lower income students are less likely to have earned PLA credit? Well, one could be cost. PLA and CPL, there can be related fees in conjunction with the assessment that are not covered by Pell Grants or financial aid. Another could be that the type of outreach, as I alluded to, that adult learners may not be hearing about this, or they may not be hearing about it at the right time. You know, if they're hearing about it during orientation, they might have so many things on their plate that it's not the right time, and it just goes in one ear and out the other because they're so focused on just getting started in their program. So they may need additional encouragement, support, or reminding of these opportunities at more points in their journey. The institutional policies and processes may need to be adjusted. So adult learners, the PLA opportunities may be focused on a limited set of learners or specific market experience or programs of study that then, as students are coming and saying, well, hey, I know about PLA, I know about CPL options, what do you have? And then the institution might say, oh, well, we only offer it for, IT or healthcare or those credentials. And so it just doesn't apply to your program. And so institutions could do a lot by expanding their opportunities and finding ways to their policies and processes to be more inclusive of credit in other disciplines. And lastly, some adult learners may just have lower confidence, right? And so they may not think that they have this learning that is worth credit, or that their experience could translate to credit in their program. And so institutions can do a better job leading students to believe that it does apply for them. So just as I was starting to allude to, there are some mitigation strategies that institutions can take. First, prioritize equity in the design of PLA and CPL. So think about those things that we were talking about, of cost, who we're reaching out to, being intentional of the offerings we have and how inclusive those are of programs, so that we're inviting and giving access to as many students as possible. So I alluded, think about the financial supports that we can put in place, or offering PLA free of charge. be intentional and expand the communications that we're doing to students about PLA, and find ways to embed it systemically in advising and curriculum, right? So don't just leave it to that orientation process or the information on the website, but make sure that advisors, this is part of their script, it's part of their process, it's part of their considerations in working with adult learners and working with them throughout their academic career. So more mitigation strategies: improve the data infrastructure and analysis to understand where equity gaps exist. I've done presentations before about PLA and find that, like I said, there are a fraction of institutions that are offering PLA in general. And then when it is being offered, there's even a fraction of those that are even doing any type of concerted, intentional analysis of what we're offering, who's taking advantage of it, what does the credit distribution look like, are we seeing differences based on identities, and what outreach can we be doing there. So certainly if you are taking those steps, that's only going to help. As I alluded, providing PLA offerings in a wide range of occupations. At our institution, we have PLA by tests and exams. We have it by portfolio, and that's for both undergraduate and graduate elective credit and general education credit, as well as we worked with and we have an open invitation to work with any program to determine their specific student learners and where they might have credit and the courses that they might be able to demonstrate that learning based on their careers or previous life experience that they could use to earn credit. And scale processes for simpler crosswalks. So don't make it as hard for the adult learner, the student, to have to read into or do mental acrobatics to think, well, how can my work or life experience get me potential credit and get me further along my program? Spell it out for them. Say, if you meet this profile or if you have this type of life experience, you can get credit in these places. Be very clear, very, very simple. And some institutions have even gone as far as to mechanize that process, right? So you would maybe fill out a survey talking about your experiences, your knowledge, your skills, and then it will spit back to you a customized report. Kale's actually rolling out a tool right now that does that for institutions. So beyond the study, we also just know inequity in learning achievement exists. It does. It's truth. It's not something, oh, not at our institution. It exists, not only in educational system abroad, but also at your institution, unless you happen to be at the only institution that is graduating every student in every identity at the exact same appropriate level, and they all have the exact appropriate equivalent learning experience. But the secret is, it doesn't have to. Just because it exists, it doesn't have to. We can take steps to develop the awareness, the mindset, to think from an equity lens to combat this. And so we can do something. We can work to make the invisible visible and the undiscussable discussable. We have the power to further inquire, examine, and act to intervene. And we have that responsibility to assess with diversity of students and diversity of learning in mind. So let's do the uncomfortable, difficult, but necessary work. I'm just going to pause. I see a comment there from JD. Yeah, so I would say that there are, obviously undertaking PLA can be overwhelming because there's a lot, even as I talked about our institution, we have so many different offerings and processes, and that takes a lot of people and system and resources. However, we've been doing PLA since 1976. We did not have as robust of options then. So it's a matter of starting small. I mean, I've even worked with institutions to just set up a one-to-one PLA exchange, right? That if you have a SHRM certification or project management or PM certification, that we talk with the business programs, we talk with our human resource programs, and we say, what can that equate to? Can students get 1 credit, 2 credits for that certification? And that doesn't really require any sort of faculty or staff evaluation other than them providing you the documentation and then you giving them the credit. And so you can start small with things like that, as well as tests like CLEP exam, the New York language exam, Dante's. All of those exams exist, and there are testing centers that you don't even have to host at your institution. You can direct students there. And then students just bring their test results and then you give them the credit. So there are some easy, small steps to be taken, but it does require the buy-in from leadership, which I think is a little easier to sell at this point because we know that adult learners are the majority. You know, as much as people talk about traditional students, they are the traditional student at this point. They make up the majority of people in college earning credit. So they are the population to cater to, and we know we need to do a better job to do that. All right, so as we keep rolling along here, I want to just cover some key terms that I've already used a little bit and I'll continue to use here as we keep going. First is equity, and I just want to give my own definition of that, this is justice according to need and fairness, and it goes beyond the same treatment, right? So in order to achieve equivalent learning outcomes across students, more support and different conditions may be required for some students compared to others in light of systemic barriers or disadvantages that they've experienced. So it's not just a one size fits all or everyone gets the same experience, but truly serving the students where they are according to their needs. We also have to be mindful of agency, which pertains to one's ability to act. And while everyone has will and could act, it's often a matter of creating space for that, empowering them, and a matter of self-motivation in order for agency to be employed or enacted. Our students have great potential for agency, but faculty, staff, and administrators need to keep that in mind and think about the student experience so that we are both inclusive of that and can be exponential enablers to encourage their agency in their experience. Now, bias should be a relatively familiar term, but I wanted to be sure and point out that bias is not always charged positively or negatively, right? So bias is about one's leaning or influence, where one could be biased towards all students having access to higher education, just as likely as someone else could be biased towards prohibiting access based on specific identities or demographics. It's also important to recognize that unconscious bias exists. So meaning we may not actively know or be aware of how our biases are displayed or showing up in our thoughts and actions. And so knowing that, this idea that we can even be biased towards positive things just reinforces that we all have to be careful and considerate and make sure we have a number of perspectives as we're making decisions for the rainbow coalition of diverse needs and identities of our students. Along those lines, positionality names the reality that our identities and experience influence the way we see and move through our world. So positionality can encompass and even be a starting point to identify and unpack our biases. And the last term here, methodological diversity. I know that's a mouthful, but it really is about two things: using multiple measures or methods for measurement to make sure that we're recognizing all types of learning, not just administering an exam or administering, or only accepting a written assignment, as well as capturing learning in different ways. So qualitative versus quantitative, direct versus indirect, and so on. So another quick check-in for folks that are here. And we have some more folks since the first poll. And I explained we don't have the ability to launch a poll, but we have a sizable group here that putting it in the chat would be fine for me to glean, what the responses are. So if you just want to put in what existing conversations are happening in your institution, enter A, B, C, or D for the corresponding options of which best describes the extent that specific task or process-oriented conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion are happening at your institution. In general, this isn't specific to assessment, this isn't specific to PLA, this is just in general, getting an idea of where you all are. So A, have you been talking and continue to make good progress with actions? B, you've been talking but struggled to do more than talk. C, that you've just started talking and are beginning to make some connections to what actions you could take. Or D, it just really hasn't been a priority, and there just isn't conversation or action being taken here among everything else that's going on. Okay, looks like some C's, some A's. actually so far of responses where there've been the multiples, A is actually the top with 3, which is great. And honestly, it's a spectrum. The other thing that I'll even share at our institution is sometimes there's really great work happening in pockets. And so it might be difficult to answer this question because you might say, well, in this college or in this part of campus, it's an A, but over here it's a D, and over there it's a B, which presents a struggle in and of itself. Because if we're not aligned in considering these needs and interests and priorities, even within our own institution, it can be hard to then roll out initiatives and best serve students as a whole. Okay, thanks for engaging, folks. So we talked about PLA in relation to inequity, covered some key terms. I want to delve into some assessment connections. I know we're specifically talking about PLA, but let me zoom out and talk about some principles of assessment, which applies to PLA, but also to assessment in general. So a bit of a 2-for-1 for you. I'm going to review some of the American Association of Higher Education's 1992 Principles of Good Practice for Assessment of Student Learning, that despite being almost 30 years old, still relevant, or they are 30 years old, still being relevant today for assessment practice, but also critical in work toward equity. So across several of these principles, there's some big themes around purpose and people which have equity implications. So principle number 1, the assessment of student learning begins with educational values. So this is a pretty simple one of thinking, well, just like you all responded about activity at your institution, what values are we upholding in our work? Both our general operations as well as our assessment work. Principle number 6, assessment fosters wider improvement when representatives from across the educational community are involved. Collaboration and involvement of diverse and representative perspectives matters in our work, especially when we're looking to enact or bring about change. Are there relevant identities or perspectives missing from your process? How might you have more representative involvement? Principle number 7, assessment makes a difference when it begins with issues of use and illuminates questions that people really care about. So we have to start from a place that matters to people, or we could really just be pushing paper around, or people could just be going through the motions. Reflecting on assessment efforts at your institution, what difference are you working to make? Is it related to and helping what you and your institution truly care about? So there's even a connection here, call back to principle 1 about values. Principle 8, assessment as part of a larger effort. So assessment's most likely to lead to improvement when part of larger sets of conditions that promote change. Improvement is most likely to occur when situated with institutional priorities, goals, and momentum. Position assessment in relation to those efforts to build on that momentum or ride that momentum. Priorities can and should include disrupting these educational inequities. So think for yourself at your institution, what larger conditions must be recognized as we work for change? In principle 9, through assessment, educators meet responsibilities to students and the public. We have a responsibility to engage and bring in relevant populations for who we're serving, and those we know to have a vested interest in what we're doing. So what responsibilities are you honoring with your key populations and your students? And are there audiences that you're neglecting, specifically as we think about assessment work and who's engaged? So I ran through those somewhat quickly, but to a certain extent, I imagine as you heard information there, things resonated perhaps more with you than others. So I'm going to force you to pick just one, but which principle best resonates with you and your need for equity or your assessment culture? And so to simplify this one, you can just put the number. It's like 1, 6, 7, 8, 9. But we're talking about principle 1, learning begins with values. And you can answer in a way of like this is what I think would ring truest, or where I might try and leverage to advance our efforts. So is it, associating learning with values, making sure you have representative involvement, the beginning where people care about, assessment part is a larger effort, or meeting the responsibilities to audiences. Looks like 1 and 8 are some common resonating areas. It's really hard to pick. So I know I'm forcing you to choose, and there's some interrelatedness between these, but I appreciate you all engaging and sharing. And so feel free, if you have any questions, to chat those in here about the principles, because just zooming back out to our structure for the rest of the slides, I'm going to talk specifically about ways to infuse equity in specific aspects of the assessment and PLA process, starting with learning outcomes, then looking at method selection, and then reporting. So keep that in mind for our path here, our time together. Okay, so starting with learning outcomes, if we write learning outcome statements for and with students, we increase the chances of students understanding what's expected of them, right? So including students in outcome writing is not only ensures that they understand them, but also empowers and gives them agency in their learning, right? So let's make students more than just subjects of our studies. Let's also make them collaborators and co-creators in the learning process. So as an institution, you can reflect on what constitutes as learning, what ways count, and the variety of ways that students could demonstrate learning. This combined with having students as active participants and in understanding and shaping the outcome language can showcase that we are student-centered and that we're helping students understand how they can benefit from engaging on campus. So this is a great thing. I know even at my own institution, we were just actually talking about this, of how often learning outcomes for whether it's student affairs or academic programs, how often they get changed. And we were thinking, well, they change when leadership changes. They change when external sort of accreditation or influences or industry or standards change. But this could be a way to keep an eye on being intentional in our learning outcomes, to stay current, to stay relevant, and to stay understood and interpreted correctly by students, by involving them in the process to review and give feedback on that language. So assuming we have our learning outcomes set, then we might think about, well, what are all the ways that we might be collecting data for assessment, or what are all the ways that we might consider rolling out PLA for institution? To that, I would say, well, the pursuit of easy, demonstrable measurement becomes an end in itself, and a learning a 4-second. So method selection should center student learning first, and not first focus on measurement, because doing what's easiest isn't why we're here. Moreover, if we know equity issues exist, it doesn't make sense to ignore that context when we're designing or employing our methods. So there's a great quote here of, why would we design assessments and make changes on results without considering cultural relevance of the process involved, who was involved, and who these changes are designed to impact or benefit. So think collaboratively and be sure to create space for others to operationalize their agency, whether they're students, fellow staff, collaborative faculty members, but students especially, as they can help create rubrics, shape assignment parameters, or be giving feedback, right? If you know that looking to do PLA would be a priority and it could help your students, talk to your students, do a focus group and ask them, like, well, what would you most like to see here? What would you be bringing to the table, and what would be the best bang for our buck if we were to roll out like one PLA intervention to start, or one area to begin to tackle? So reflect on how student needs are or are not included in driving needed data to be collected at your institution. Likewise, reflect and employ methodological diversity so that you can allow for multiple ways of knowing to count. What tests could be reflection papers instead, what formal presentations could also be visual or creative works. Consider approaches that allow for breadth and depth of knowledge across many students to be recognized. And ultimately think of how the data you're collecting will best tell the story of the diverse ways students are learning your institution. And I don't have time or space to go into exhaustive detail on all possible methods there. So hopefully that was helpful just as a survey of the topic. But I want to adjust or shift a little bit to go into reporting and data use. We all have positionality and implicit biases, as said earlier, that can be for or against things. And so we have to recognize and account for these. And this GIF actually is a great breakdown of actual steps to take. First recognize, then consider, then research, right? And I would ask or suggest collaborating and bringing in other perspectives, especially ones with different positionality than yours, as that can be useful as well. And I'll say it again, we all have prejudices and biases. Our positionality is informed by that, plus our identities, our values, all shaping how we see and move through the world. So it's not just a matter of, say, using a rubric to be more objective, or think that this isn't a consideration that applies to you because you're a good person or you possess marginalized identities. We can't see all the angles of all situations. And so that's why it's all the more important for us to have multiple perspectives involved so that it'll illuminate more about what may truly be taking place with our data and what's going on, what we're measuring and the situation for students, as well as challenging any assumptions or leading narratives that may be at play. Methodological diversity was mentioned before as a way to capture multiple ways of knowing. Doing so can help provide a more complete picture of what's going on with student learning. We need to treat data as part of a system and not silos of insight. And make disaggregation of data routine and necessary. Disaggregating data serves as a medium through which folks can learn about unequal outcomes. And as the quote here shows, aggregation may not tell the complete story. While the aggregate story may be positive, there could be these differing narratives within specific populations when you dig in to look at their experiences. When we focus on the overall or the average, we can really risk masking the margins and just teaching to the middle. So while folks need to account for interpreting their results, make sure you're building in time to review and reflect on your process and findings. What voices and perspectives were included, which were excluded? Are there opportunities you could better include certain perspectives as you go forward? And think about all your relevant audiences: faculty, staff, administrators, students, community members, employers. And be sure when you're reviewing your data and setting targets in the planning phase that you do so one of two ways: either general targets for all students or population specific targets. What you don't want to do is compare populations against one another. You don't want to say something like, well, commuter students had lower scores than resident students, or Latinx students scored lower than white students, or males scored less than females. Doing this inadvertently positions and upholds one population as the norm or expectation, and that shouldn't be the case, as we care about the success of all of our students. So instead, set an overall target, like all students will score a 3 or higher per item on this rubric, or population specific, where you've noted differences in the past, right? So Black males had an average score of 85% compared to their previous average of 80% last year. Doing that to note their growth as well as the historical information, rather than saying, well, Black males scored this in comparison to white male students. So either do it in relation to an overall target that applies to all disaggregated populations you're looking at, or individual targets. And be careful when we're talking about our data. Storytelling matters, and data don't speak for themselves. We give voice to them with our interpretation, so we need to best tell the stories of whom the data represents. And because it's student data, it's really not our story to tell. So why not involve the students that the data is representing? And remember that campus politics are real and can impact actions or interpretation of assessment results. So this is where collaboration can be important. You may need some signaling power or cultural capital to communicate certain messages, which may not be popular or what people want to hear. And so having more people involved in the process and your sort of alliance on campus can present a stronger front when you're talking about potentially some pretty difficult conversations at your institution. And don't shy away from making connections to the institutional or area goals or strategy. And this goes back to some folks preferencing the principles of positioning assessment within larger initiatives. Use institutional momentum to keep your assessment data in the forefront while also keeping the equity conversation relevant to our daily work. And so again, this also ties to the larger idea of PLA. If your institution isn't doing PLA, this is something I even am challenging our own institution. Despite having a pretty robust PLA program, we're part of our strategic plan is we're talking about how we're going to be better adult serving, a better adult serving institution. And I talk about, yes, and that's true with PLA, but there's so much more we could be doing to more seamlessly embed that into a true adult learner ready experience. And if that's the value or the initiative or goal we're trying to head towards, helping them understand the reality of what's going to take for us to get there. And make sure, despite what your reporting process is, probably most importantly, to use and act on the data, right? All assessments could stand to have more actions and use of the results, which includes sharing to targeted audiences where there's just far too little action going on. But with equity in mind, go back to your reflections of inclusion, incorporated perspectives, trying to center students on the margins, and making data disaggregation the norm. We don't want to overtreat populations by rolling out interventions to all when only a fraction of students need it, right? Leverage identity and experience specificity in order to act to improve. And just to remind you, I have to remind folks often, we as educators have a responsibility to use data and act for improvement. We're collecting the data anyway. We know inequities and issues exist with respect to student learning, so we should be prioritizing trying to remove those barriers and best support student learning. It's the core of why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing. So I covered a number of examples of how equity, how you can infuse equity work or leverage assessment or PLA efforts to advance equity institutions at your institution. So which of those would you perhaps look to first engage in? Or if you're already doing some of these, that you would spend more time doing or revisiting? A, aspects of equity in the learning outcome statements. B, equity in method selection. C, equity in reporting and data use. Or D, the bonus of instilling equity mindedness with people, which, if we're doing that, self work or individual work, hopefully, then A, B, and C we might see some progress there as well. Okay. Thanks for the responses, folks. So I had, and let me type this in the chat for you all to make it a little easier. I made a document here, and I'll share the screen as well, but here it is in the chat. If you click on that link, it'll ask you, it'll take you to a Google document. It'll say, do you want to make a copy of this? Say yes, because ultimately I'm giving you this document that has my contact information, a link to the presentation, a link to some free organizations that you can check out, as well as a link to some of the articles that were referenced and mentioned in this presentation. But then it also has, and this is why why I ask you to make a copy, it has then this 3-2-1-1 worksheet of 3 things you learned today, 2 things you found interesting, 1 question you still have, and 1 action item to take back. And so you make your own copy so that you can fill that out on your own, but you'll have access to all this information. And I wanted to make sure to give that to you so that you had something to walk away with, and something to reflect on in relation to this information. But also I wanted to give it to you, especially the little worksheet, so that you can start thinking about if you have lingering questions or questions of any of the content that I presented. So it's something to plant that seed for some Q&A. So I just have a few more slides to run through, and I'm going to do that and then turn it over for any questions or discussion that people want to have here, because we'll have a good chunk of time here for that. So reflecting on application here, first, remember why we're here. All our students matter, and we have to acknowledge that society is underserving and disadvantaging some students, which impacts their ability to succeed in college. And we owe it to our students to dig deeper than just looking at averages or treating the student body as a single group or doing one-size-fits-all solutions for our support, if we truly want to help them. And equity work, isn't over until all students are experiencing equivalent learning outcomes and success. And even then, it's still not over, because there's still personal work we each need to do on our journeys. There's, even if we solve educational inequity, there's larger inequities in other aspects of life in our society that we can be working to dismantle. But truly, we can go farther faster when we work together and when we're aligned on these issues and values. And we need to work together to ensure we're minimizing our biases and best using our positionality for this work. So think about, examining your own power. How are you using the power that you have, the positionality you have, to enact change? And whose power can you leverage to further equitable efforts on your campus? And don't underestimate the power of data either. Use it to amplify your voice and your message. Work with students and work with others to be the voice for that data and tell your narrative. And with respect to methodologies, right? Think about what's stopping you from using multiple methods. Is it lack of knowledge or familiarity? Well, if so, then make that the priority for your professional development, or brainstorm with others in planning sessions to identify opportunities. Is it the worry of being overwhelmed with multiple measures for multiple outcomes? Well, you don't always have to measure everything all the time. So focus on a few or start small, and then really dig into those to understand what's going on, and then rotate those as you go along. Think about what opportunities you have to use different methods, where you're collecting quantitative data that perhaps you could be gathering some qualitative stories to better understand what student learning is going on there, or inquire with internal and external colleagues about where and when specific methods could be employed or shown to be useful and broaden your perspective. And it's one of the other reasons why I put in that handout some information about articles and professional organizations, because those are also resources that you can engage with on the topic, specifically with an assessment lens. And we know change doesn't come easy. If equity and social justice were easy to solve, great and smart people would have done so already. It's messy, complicated, and requires everyone to do their part to bring about necessary change. So think about what you can do. If you don't think you can do much, think about who you work with or have an influence and what they can do. Individual actions, personal and professional, no matter how small, they matter, and they can add up, and they can really make a difference for an individual student You can role model language, behavior that influences others, whether you know it or not. So think hard about what role you can play and set those goals and actions to work toward betterment for all. So shifting away from those key concepts, consider the following student-related questions as a starting point with equity work. So, who are student populations who stand to benefit from PLA, particularly at our institution? What are all the ways we're recognizing or valuing learning among our students? How can we best reach our students to inform and engage them on PLA? And then talk to your students. Ask them, for which learning or skills do you wish you could gain credit? When do you think you'd learn or it'd be best to be reminded about PLA options? And how would you like to be more active, engaged, or empowered in your learning experience? These are just a couple examples of questions to ask. You may have your own campus cultural needs or knowledge that'll shape what you ask, but hopefully you understand the value of incorporating diverse perspectives and hearing directly from your students as you engage in equity work, both in general as well as in relation to assessment and prior learning assessment. It's like these questions here, you can be seeking honest feedback on what we can be doing better to meet student needs, what additional representation or perspectives should we have at our institution, and how we can further amplify student voice and needs. Okay, well, with our final 12 minutes here, I want to make sure and see what questions folks might have. Here's my contact info. It's also on the handout. The link is in the chat. We have just a little group here, so I don't think it'll be too chaotic. If folks want to, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to do it in the chat or unmute yourself and talk. Whatever's going to work best for folks. I'm actually going to end the slideshow just so that I can potentially see anybody, see anybody's faces. And if there are no questions, enjoy some free time between sessions. But I will hang here and see if anybody has any lingering thoughts or comments before we end our time. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Kim.
I have a sort of a what can I do with this kind of question. And because I really appreciated what you're saying about disaggregating data and not just comparing groups to one another, because I feel like that is happening a lot around me, and it kind of drives me crazy. And I am a firm believer in set some kind of a standard, any kind of a standard, and compare to that, right?
Yeah.
But I hear over and over again from people, and this is the what do I do with this part, well, I don't know what standard is. We don't have a standard. We can't set a standard. We have no idea, and it's partly I'm very new in my position, so partly I'm sort of just taking note. It's okay, then we use that as a benchmark, that maybe.
Yeah.
But I feel like, we could spend the next 2 years sort of looking at things as benchmarks, and we need to move, we need to move forward, And so do you have any ideas about what to do with that particular problem?
Absolutely, because I encounter this all the time as well. And, I think about a guy that I worked with years ago. He taught me this Jedi mind trick, where, he said, if you're dealing with somebody and talking about an issue and they say they don't know, then ask them, well, what if you did know? He said, usually if you put that question out there, they'll start talking. They'll say, well, maybe this, maybe that. But more concretely, I love sharing that little nugget because it stuck with me. But what I do is I say, I guarantee I could give you 3 sets of data. I could give you a number that you would say, oh my gosh, that's amazing, right? It would pleasantly surprise you. I could give you a number then that also would mortify you. And you would say, I can't believe that's what's going on. I'm so embarrassed. Like, we can't report this. And then I could give you a number that you would look at and go, yeah, that's about what we thought, right? And so I say, so tell me, like, what would those numbers be, right? And when you phrase it that way, then that's when they can start to say, well, I bet, like, I think this is probably where we'd come out, or I'd feel comfortable saying this, because I remind them that whatever we set now, we can change. Assessment is iterative, right? And if we've never
I'm
collected the data
constantly telling
before,
people that.
yeah, if
Yeah.
we've never collected the data before, how can we intelligently have a number? We can't. So we make our best educated guess, our hypothesis, we put it down, we go through the process, we report, and in your report, you say, that's how you interpret the results. Well, great. We were great on the money, right? Or we were really close. Or, wow, we really underestimated our students here, and we should raise our target for next year. Or the opposite. Wow, we didn't realize this is what was going on. We're going to need to lower our target. Or we're keeping our target, and we need to do a lot of work to try and bring ourselves up to meet it. But that then becomes your story and can become an immediate action item, right? Revise your target. Boom,
Right.
there you go.
Yeah.
So I think it's, now obviously you need to also clear it with the powers that be that might be looking at the reports and looking at those targets and achievement of them. But I know at my institution, other institutions I've worked, as long as they know the good work is being done and it's being done intentionally, they're less concerned about whether a target's being met or not than whether intentional data-informed action is happening and improvement is happening where it needs to. And even some of the best examples of reports at my own institution have been ones where they miss nearly all their targets, but they're very rigorous, intentionally set targets, right? And so it's like, yeah, they're not there yet because they wanted to see X, Y, or Z. They haven't seen all that. So then here are the actions they're taking. Here's the success they have had. It did bring them up. They were closer than they were last year. But I think that can help disarm people a little bit and lower their anxiety around the process because they feel like they're going to be judged. And it's like, no, this is for you. First and foremost, it's for you to know if the reality of the interventions you're doing with your students is what you expected. And so let's articulate let's quantify what you expected to then see how reality compares to that.
Well, and one of the things I'm going to try doing in a workshop later this semester is even just do like a 50-50 rule and say like, okay, well, if you can't come up with anything else, how about if we do a coin flip, and say if
or
your
simple majority,
if like 50% or more of your students are not where you want them to be, I'm guessing you'd see that as a problem. So let's use that as a benchmark, just to start with. But yeah.
and that's, and I also reiterate too that that's then the importance of having these set targets, because without them it becomes really easy and sometimes dangerous to just interpret the results. Because I have we have one of our business programs uses this external instrument that's like this simulator of business case studies, and they say like you should expect, like, the norm is an average of a 45%, because it's not quite like like 100% ace. It's not like a grading equivalent scale. So they help prime you, like, if you're getting like 40s and 50s, that's okay, right? Like, don't freak out and think your students do bad. But without that context, right, when our provosts and deans sort of pick up this report and they see like 45%, that's what you're aiming for, like, what are you doing? That's why it's important to get that context. Likewise, somebody could get 80% on some other instrument, and 80% sounds good. I mean, on a grading scale it's a B. But what if you knew that the year before they got 95? When all of a sudden that 80 didn't sound so great, right? And so if we're not setting these targets, then you're just leaving so much room for interpretation of what those results mean. And that's why it's important to work towards honing in on what would be appropriate to have.
Yeah, I'm with you. Totally.
Okay. Well, good luck.
Thank you. And I'll be seeing you at Sal for the next couple of months. So
Nice.
yeah, I'm bringing a whole group of student affairs people from my college. So
Oh, are they doing the course?
yeah, I've got
Awesome.
like me and I think 7 other people doing it. So
Great.
yep.
Yeah, don't
We're
hesitate to reach
excited.
out. Yeah, it's it's both the like busiest 8 weeks of my life, like during the year, but also like the most exciting and fun because it's all crammed into one chunk. So
And
I
isn't
get
that often the way?
yeah, yeah.
The stuff that's the most fun
Yeah,
takes a lot of
exactly.
work.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you go, and I will
All
see you
right.
later.
All right. Thanks, Kim.